Let's talk about consent. Consent is foundationally important. Now, sometimes you hear people use the slogan, consent is sexy. It's meant as a way to promote consent, but I strongly dislike this slogan. People find different things sexy. They have different kinks, and no one person is required to find the same thing sexy as someone else. What one finds sexy is up to individual subjective preference. But consent isn't like that. Consent is mandatory. Whether you find it sexy or not, you're required to attend to consent in all sexual encounters. There's no real reasonable philosophical debate about whether or not consent is necessary. In our class, we're never going to ask, is consent important? It is. Instead, we're going to try to understand more about consent. Now, let's start off with, there are some things that are not consent. Clothing. Clothing is not consent. It doesn't matter how somebody is dressed. There is no such thing as clothes that grant consent. Silence. Silence is not consent, nor is freezing in place or just going along with sexual acts out of fear. Consent given while highly intoxicated, while super drunk or super high, is not binding consent because a person has to know what they're consenting to. And consent given when there's no real possibility of saying no is not consent, even if the person voices the word yes. Consent always must be able to be revoked or withdrawn. If somebody says yes, but then passes out, they are no longer consenting to the sexual experience. If somebody said yes, and then situations change such that they can no longer easily exit the sexual encounter, maybe now the door is locked and they can't get out, this is no longer a consensual encounter. Consent always has to have the possibility of being revoked. When must consent be secured? For each new partner? For each new sexual encounter? For each new sexual activity? Yes, consent is needed for all of these things. As we get to know people better and better, we might develop more efficient ways of communicating so that sometimes it's possible to communicate consent more efficiently than with somebody who you are just meeting for the first time. However, consent always needs to be in place. It always needs to be communicated. It cannot simply be presumed. So now we get to start asking some complicated questions about how can consent be communicated. Does it need to be written out in a 20-page long binding contract? No, that's not how consent in fact works. Does it need to always be spoken out loud? Well, not everyone communicates by speaking out loud. Some people use sign language. Some people are nonverbal. Some people, again, do not communicate their preferences by using spoken words. There can be a variety of different forms of communication. Sometimes people will write things down. Sometimes people will use sign. Sometimes people will use, spoken words. What's important is that the participants to the sexual encounter have a clearly defined, mutually understood way to communicate with one another. Sometimes body language can supplement, but not fully take the place of, different or additional forms of communication. If somebody says, "Do you want me to go down on you?" and the other person makes eye contact, smiles excitedly, leans forward and kisses them enthusiastically, is that consent? Probably. It sure seems like it. It seems like they are using multiple forms of body language to communicate that this is something that they want. However, if it's somebody you don't know well, if you don't really know if that's their way of communicating, yes, I am into this, or if that's just what they do when they feel nervous or awkward, you need to slow way down in order to make sure that everybody is on the same page about how consent is being communicated. Now, the best way to make sure consent is in place is to check in with your partner or partners on a regular basis, not just multiple times throughout the relationship, but throughout the encounter. Asking questions like, do you like this? Does this feel good? Do you want me to keep doing this, or should I start doing that other thing or something else? Right? Do you want to hook up, or should we just, I don't know, scroll through Netflix for the next several hours without actually watching anything? If you aren't sure if somebody is in a position to consent, don't hook up with them, right? Just chill out. Um, it sounds like a truly bad, gut wrenchingly stressful, horrifying, and potentially morally atrocious sexual encounter if everybody involved isn't sure if the others are able to consent, right? So you have to be worried about whether or not your partner is in a position to consent to the sexual activity. Don't have that sexual activity. Wait for the next night. Wait for a time when people are probably less drunk, or whatever it is that might be inhibiting their ability to communicate. So don't put yourself in the position of having to wonder if you're doing an awful thing to somebody. And obviously, don't do that awful thing if you know for sure that they are not in a position to consent, right? Attend to your partner or partner's well-being. So consent is foundationally important. We want to make sure we're always structuring our sexual encounters so that consent is prioritized, supported, and enabled for everybody involved. Let's talk about 3 models of consent: semantic consent, affirmative consent, and enthusiastic consent. Let's start off with semantic consent. Semantic consent is the mere presence of the word yes. This is a model that we see, sometimes it still is encoded into law. It is certainly outdated, and by now most people have strongly moved away from this way of thinking about sex and consent. The semantic model of consent only looks for this one moment of yes or no before the sexual encounter and presumes that as long as somebody has said the word yes, then consent is in place for the entirety of the sexual encounter. The semantic model doesn't really differentiate between pressured sex and wanted sex, so long as the participants have said the word yes. This model also does not allow for retracting consent after it's been given, nor does it require that all participants stay conscious after saying yes. This is the model of consent that's used by the commodity model of sex. Next, we have the affirmative model of consent. This is one of the 2 contemporary models of consent that we're going to talk about. So under the affirmative model of consent, there must be ongoing communication from all participants. All participants need to be actively communicating that they wish to engage in the sexual encounter. This requires ongoing check-ins and communication. A single yes is not sufficient. Under this model, consent must be active. Again, it must be affirmative. A pressured or reluctant yes does not count as consent. Affirmative consent requires that everyone be able to express consent throughout the encounter. So if somebody is not conscious, then they are not able to communicate consent. Similarly, if somebody is bound or gagged in such a way where they are not able to express ongoing consent or are not able to retract their consent, then this does not count as a consensual encounter. This is the model of consent used by the performance model of sex. Third, we have the enthusiastic model of consent. Now, many people learn this model of consent as, maybe the next step after the affirmative model of consent. It certainly is intended as a sex-positive model of consent. The enthusiastic model of consent requires that there be ongoing communication from all participants that they actively wish to engage in that sexual encounter, so far the same as the affirmative model of consent. And this model requires that all of the participants must be unambiguously enthusiastic about what's going on in this sexual encounter. So this model, again, adopts the affirmative model, but adds on this requirement that all the participants have a very specific emotional state of mind. So if someone feels an emotion other than enthusiasm, that will not count as consensual. Now, again, I think the pull of this model is that people often think if somebody's not enthusiastic, that must mean that they are reluctant or opposed to the sexual encounter. But those are not the only two emotions that human beings have, right? Sometimes people are really excited about this particular kind of sexual encounter, but they're also nervous. Maybe they have like a huge crush and they're like, oh my goodness, it's finally happening. This is so exciting. So they're also really nervous. That's not going to count as enthusiastic under the enthusiastic model of consent because they're not just enthusiastic, they're also really nervous. Maybe somebody is trying out a new kind of sexual activity or a new kind of sexual position, and they're into it. But they're also just very curious, right? They have no idea if they're going to like it or not. They absolutely trust their partner or partners. They know that if they don't like it, it will stop immediately, but they're just kind of like, who knows? Let's see if I like farm animal role play. Sure. Right? So they might just, in fact, be curious. Again, because they're not feeling just unambiguous enthusiasm, that will not count as a consensual sexual encounter under the enthusiastic model. Or if somebody is feeling just like gentle happiness, right? Really, they experience sexual interactions as a very intimate, like deep moment of connection. It's not like wild party enthusiasm, it's just gentle, lovely happiness. Once again, because the emotional experiences that they're feeling in that moment are not enthusiasm, that does not meet the criteria of the enthusiastic model of consent. Final concern about the enthusiastic model of consent is that it rules out instances in which somebody might be engaging in sexual interactions for instrumental reasons, right? So now that's technical terms. Let's think about what that means. Sometimes we do something as an end in itself. The whole goal is to be having sex. You want to be having sex, you're consenting because you want to be having the sex. Sometimes we want to have sex for other reasons. Maybe you want to have sex because you know that your partner had a really bad day, and sex is one of the ways by which they just feel validated and connected to other people. You're fine with it. You're happy to do it. But like the main reason you want to have sex in that moment is because you care about your partner and you know that it would be meaningful to them right there. That will not count as consent under the enthusiastic model. Similarly, if somebody is engaged in sex work, if they're doing it because it's their job, it will not count as enthusiastic consent, right? We don't have to think about instances where somebody is forced into sex work, right? So that's an instance where clearly it is non-consensual and somebody has been forced into this, is not in a position to consent. However, there are many instances where somebody might be engaging in chosen sex work. They're engaging in it because it's their job. Maybe they love it. Maybe they love their job. But for everyone who's ever been employed, there are instances where you do your job because it's your damn job, right? That's what it is to have a job. That's the world that we live in. For one of the reasons we do our jobs is because it's our job. So under the enthusiastic model of consent, if somebody is engaging in sex work because it's their job, even if they love their job, the reason they're doing any individual instance of sex is because it's their job, and that does not count as feeling unambiguously enthusiastic purely about the sexual encounter. So the enthusiastic model of consent, first of all, rules out the possibility of sex work ever being consensual. And second, it rules out the possibility for consensual experimentation. It rules out the possibility for new sexual encounters. It rules out the possibility for sexual encounters where you are feeling, again, nervous or apprehensive. Folks who are maybe just figuring out their own sexual orientations often feel very, very nervous with some of those early sexual encounters not because they're opposed in any way, nervous about the sexual encounter itself, but because of everything that goes along with it. So the enthusiastic model of consent is not going to allow space for any of those kinds of sexual interactions. Right. So these are some worries about the enthusiastic model of consent. It seems like it is well intentioned, but the things that it adds onto the affirmative model of consent don't actually seem to, support a gentle and flourishing sexual interactions in the way that we would hope that a robust and well developed model of consent would do. So we have these three models of consent. Once again, they are semantic consent, affirmative consent, and enthusiastic consent.